Section 1 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rutger. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a freeholder by John Erskine. Introduction. Several late pamphlets composed with much art and ability, and recommended by many of the beauties of language, have painted in black and hateful colors the claims and conduct of the North Americans, and thereby have not a little inflamed the resentment of the mother country. The author of this small tract, though deeply sensible of the inferiority of his talents, yet confiding in the goodness of his cause, humbly attempts to soften that resentment. He represents, from the writings of colonists and of gentlemen who had the best access to know their sentiments, what concessions might have been procured from them by gentle measures, and what they complained of in those acts of Parliament which immediately occasioned their taking up arms. With this view, he prepared for the press the following reflections about a year ago. They would have been published the beginning of last session of Parliament, had it not been prevented by the negligence of one with whom the manuscript was entrusted. It was not till after many months that he recovered the manuscript. Want of leisure and very imperfect and doubtful information as to the late facts and reasonings have permitted him to make no important addition, unless a paragraph occasioned by the pamphlet entitled Common Sense. Still he flatters himself that this publication, though late, is not unseasonable. He wishes to convince his fellow freeholders, especially such of them who have seats in Parliament, that if the success of the British arms shall put it in our power to prescribe to our colonies conditions of peace, it will be our duty, our honor, and our interest, by a generous use of victory, to regain the lost affection of our old friends, and to extinguish in them every desire of becoming independent on Great Britain. 18th October 1776. End of section 1.
Section 1 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a freeholder by John Erskine. Reflections 1 to 3. 1. Had authority determined me which side to take in the important question, how the mother country ought to conduct herself towards the colonies, I would have embraced these sentiments in favors of administration, which happen to be popular and fashionable with the greater part of my neighbors, my nearest relations, my most intimate friends, and the gentlemen with whom I generally think and act in other matters. But no authority, however respectable, can be pled against reason. No names or numbers will warrant my ascribing justice or wisdom to measures in which my understanding thinks it discerns the reverse. A fair state of the grounds of my opinion will satisfy the impartial that I have not formed it rashly, and may furnish many of my countrymen, who, to judge candidly, with some not unuseful information, scattered in books, pamphlets, and periodical publications, which they have not opportunity or leisure to peruse, as to the sentiments of the colonists, their manner of pleading their own cause, and the regard due to some of their pleas. 2. One chief circumstance that hath reconciled a great part of the nation to war with the colonies is an apprehension that there was a general desire in them of independence on the mother country. Their extensive territory holds some temperate climate, luxuriant and fertile soil, rapid population, commodious ports, and variety of products, united many of their friends and enemies in the idea that North America would one day become the seat of a flourishing empire. It is not improbable that, in some future period, this would have happened, and artful designing men found it no difficult task to excite or cherish suspicions that the colonies were already aiming at this, and that checking their growth and abridging their liberties was the only method of defeating their schemes. But an able writer, no way biased in favor of the colony claims, and who had the best advantage for knowing facts, hath borne ample testimony that the colonists in general were loyal to their sovereign, while affected to the mother country, zealous for her prosperity, and far from harboring any rebellious designs against the just rights of government. Their merchants are, and ever must be, in a great measure allied with these of Britain. Their very support consists in this alliance, and nothing but false policy here can break it. Footnote: Pownell's Administration of the Colonies, 4th edition, London, 1768, page 40 in dedication, page 6 and 8. End of footnote. Their political and religious principles are incompatible with submitting to the government, or asking the protection of France or Spain. No one colony could by itself shake off dependence on the mother country, and no two had any common magistracy or principle of association, till the attempting to connect them to us by power connected them to one another in policy. Before this, their different charters, forms of governments, manners and customs, religious sentiments, jarring claims and interests, and the rivalship and jealousy arising from all these, prevented any such union among them, one with another, as all of them had with the mother country. Footnote: Pownell's Administration, pages 35, 38, 93. End of footnote. That there might be amongst them men of republican principles, or men ambitious to be the heads of a new kingdom or commonwealth, is no unnatural supposition. But had Britain left them in the happy situation in which they were before the Stamp Act, these would have been few in number, and could never have persuaded 12 provinces to revolt from a government, under which they felt themselves easy and secure. In answer to this, it may be urged that a pamphlet entitled Common Sense, published in Philadelphia the beginning of this year, argues the necessity of the colonies declaring themselves independent of Britain. I reply, that pamphlet has been refuted by other writers in Philadelphia, under the signatures of Candidus, Rationalis, and Cato. The following extract from Cato's second letter to the people of Philadelphia, 11th March 1776, will, I hope, be acceptable to some of my readers. Nor have many weeks yet elapsed since the first open proposition for independence was published to the world. By what men of consequence this scheme is supported, or whether by any, may possibly be the subject of future inquiry. Certainly it has no countenance from the Congress, to whose sentiments we look up with reverence. On the contrary, it is directly repugnant to every declaration of that respectable body. It would be needless to quote particular passages in proof of this, as they are to be met with in almost every page of their proceedings. I will refer to a few only, viz., their resolves, March 5th, 1775, their declaration, July 6th, their address to the King, July 8th, their letter to the Lord Mayor of London, and more especially their declaration for a fast, 12th June, in which, with the deepest marks of sincerity, they call upon all America to join with them in addressing the great governor of the world, humbly beseeching him to avert the desolating judgments with which we are threatened, to bless our rightful sovereign, etc., that so America may soon behold the redress of her many grievances, the restoration of her invaded rights, and reconciliation with the parent state, on terms constitutional and honorable to both. Will anyone be so hardy as to say that either the appointment or observation of this solemn day was a mere mockery of heaven and earth? I trust not. I might add the sentiments of our own representatives in assembly, expressed in the instructions to their delegates, the sentiments of Maryland in similar instructions, the resolves of New Jersey and New Hampshire, nor shall the much injured province of Massachusetts Bay be left out of their catalogue, whose provincial congress, while yet bleeding with the wounds received at Lexington, thus addressed the inhabitants of Great Britain. These are marks of ministerial vengeance against this colony, but they have not yet detached us from our royal sovereign, etc., trusting that in a constitutional connection with the mother country we shall soon be a free and happy people. Some future opportunity, I doubt not, to make it appear that independence is not the cause in which America is now engaged, and is only the idol of those who wish to subvert all order among us, and rise on the ruins of their country. Late events do not prove what the colonies originally intended, but what advantages artful men have gained to mislead them from the conduct of administration. 3. But are not the American claims of exemption from parliamentary taxation a virtue of renouncing subjection to the king and dependence on the mother country? If the Americans have the exclusive right of taxing themselves, what power is to remain in the supreme legislature? May the British Parliament tell them how much they shall contribute? If the sum may be prescribed, they will return few thanks for the power of raising it. Footnote: surely there is no compliment to Lord North's conciliatory motion. End of footnote. If they are at liberty to grant or to deny, they are no longer subjects. Footnote: Taxation, No Tyranny, 3rd edition, page 52. End of footnote. In sovereignty there are no gradations. There may be limited monarchy, but there can be no limited government. There must in every society be some power or other from which there is no appeal, which admits no restriction, which pervades the whole mass of the community, enacts laws or repeals them, erects or annuls judicatures, extends or contracts privileges, exempt itself from question or control. From this all legal rights are emanations, which, whether equitably or not, may be legally recalled. The charter by which provincial governments are constituted may be always legally, and where it is either inconvenient in its nature or misapplied in its use, may be equitably repealed. Could a gentleman of good sense and penetration seriously think that these principles and reasonings had any chance to reconcile the colonies to the claim of Parliament to make laws for them in every case whatsoever? Was not this telling them, you cannot be subjects of Britain unless you are slaves? You renounce your allegiance and deserve to be hanged as rebels unless you acknowledge in Britain an unlimited power to give you law, a power to forbid and punish your worshipping God according to the dictates of your conscience, to stop the liberty of the press, to take every farthing of your money without your consent, to abolish trial by juries, and to deprive you of every security for liberty, property, or life itself. But why do I talk of depriving you of what you never possessed? You have no rights, which are not revocable at pleasure. You, and all that you have, are the property of your rulers, and whatever they demand, whatever they inflict, you are traitors if you do not submit. What can be the probable effects of this wonderful doctrine, if it has any effect at all, unless to drive the colonies to the madness of despair, by that madness to inflame in the mother country the rage of resentment, and by the consequences of both to facilitate the success of the machinations of France, of Spain, and of a popish pretender, or the invectives of a crisis, or North Britain, the eloquence of a Junius, and the wit of a Churchill, give not half the wounds to the peace of the British Empire, which she receives from the pen of this her pretended advocate. Let Tories beware of breathing out threatening and slaughter against those who have occasioned the violent proceedings of the North Americans, lest these evils should fall on his head, who is neither the least able nor the least zealous of their friends. Strange, however, as it may seem, it is no less true than strange that many who profess and fancy themselves Whigs approve and admire this author, and the faithful retailer of his principles, the Reverend Mr. John Wesley. Would their forefathers, who so successfully opposed despotism in a prince, have heard with patience that the House of Commons, whose power was wholly derived from their constituents, might, at the requisition of the other branches of the legislature, lawfully divest their constituents of every power, right, and privilege, and that the constituents could not, except by rebellion, resist the act thus divesting them. In some future period it is not impossible that a majority in both houses of Parliament, bribed by posts and pensions, may compliment an ambitious monarch with absolute power. Law hath not fixed a precise line, beyond which the authority of the supreme legislature over subjects cannot extend. But doth it therefore follow that this authority is unlimited, and that if it is exercised to annul that security for national happiness, which is the great end of government, the people have no right to prevent the ruin of themselves and posterity by opposing this wanton perversion of power? Can Britons boast of their constitution and liberty if others have a right of taking from them at pleasure everything that passion or interest prompts them to take? Would slavery and wretchedness be less galling and intolerable, because imposed by all the branches of the legislature, and not assumed by the prince in opposition to lords and commons? Is such an injury to be tolerated because 200 or 300 concur in it, and add ingratitude and breach of trust to injustice? But to return to the case of the colonies, it will not follow, if they are at liberty to give or to refuse the money requested by Parliament, that therefore they are no longer subjects of the British Empire. The members of the House of Commons are subjects of our sovereign, and yet have a right to grant or deny the subsidies he asks. A state is not independent on its rulers, though these rulers have not authority to destroy it. The absolute command of the purse is not necessary to that dependence or subjection, whether of individuals or communities, which is consistent with liberty and property. A dependence or subjection incompatible with these, the British Constitution is happily ignorant of. The Irish choose their own representatives, by whom alone they are taxed, and will not allow the British legislature to alter a word in a law to tax them. Their acts are sent over to be approved, not by the British Parliament, but by the Crown. Yet they dispute not the authority of their rightful sovereign, or their dependency on Britain. The British monarch appoints their Lord Lieutenants, who, when he thinks proper, adjourns, prorogues, or dissolves their Parliament. The assertion that colony charters may be always legally, and where the present state finds them inconvenient, even equitably revoked, is warning the colonies to put no trust in the promises of Britain, because Britain may legally and even equitably break them when she thinks it convenient. It is, however, to be hoped the colonies will not mistake the voice of this writer for that of Parliament or administration. This would be as unjust as to impute to a general the cruelty or treachery committed without his knowledge or consent, whether by a mercenary or volunteer in the service. End of section 2. Section 3 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder by John Erskine. Reflections 4. 4. I am not sufficiently acquainted with the charters of the several colonies to determine the nature and extent of their dependence on Britain. One who has been governor to some of them, and whose testimony the friends of administration will not call in question, hath given this account of it. Before the civil wars, the king considered the colonies not as subjects of the realm, but as his subjects in these his foreign dominions, and on that account, when Parliament 1621 and 1624 attempted to take cognizance of their affairs, it was objected to by the servants of the crown and dropped. The colonists viewed themselves as in immediate connection and subordination to the king, and they and their posterity were acknowledged entitled to enjoy all the liberties and immunities of free denizens and natural subjects, to all intents and purposes, as if they had been abiding and born within the realm. No government, therefore, less free than that which they had left, could be justly established among them. Hence their general assemblies had power of enacting laws, imposing taxes, erecting courts, and creating magistrates. They acknowledged themselves subordinate to England, and that she might justly restrain them from anything repugnant to her rights and interests, but held their allegiance only as due to their sovereign as their head, not as the head of another people. They were all in the true spirit and meaning of the thing, counties palatine, and some of them were actually and expressly created so. Considered as having quitted the realm, they were incorporated into distinct communities, had the jura regalia granted them, and their own peculiar legislatures, free, uncontrolled, and complete, in conjunction with the king's deputy. Their constitution was treated as the same with that of Jersey, which had a right to hold a convention of the 3 estates of the island, in which the king's governor had a negative voice, and where the great business was raising money to supply public occasions. In the year 1643, the Lords and Commons assumed the executive powers of government, and were in fact the acting sovereign. In that capacity they made laws for the plantations, nay, in 1646 charged them with a tax excise, but at the same time exempted them from all other tax or duty, provided their trade was carried on in English bottoms. On the restoration of the monarchy, the Parliament taking up the idea from the power they had exerted during the Commonwealth, that the colonies belonged to the realm, and the king having participated with them, his sovereignty over these his foreign dominions, they became in fact subjects of the kingdom, and Parliament, in the capacity of supreme legislature of the realm, interposed in regulating their trade, limiting their rights and property, and even taxing them. Henceforth king and Parliament conjointly may be stated as sovereign, and the colonists as subjects. Still, however, if these subjects were entitled to the rights and privileges of Englishmen, the power of this sovereign must have some bounds in its extension and exercise. And here questions naturally arise, whether this sovereign can disenfranchise them of their rights, because settled beyond the territorial limits of the realm, whether they are entitled to a constitution of the same political liberty as that which they left, or whether the whole of their constitutions are liable to be new, modeled, and reformed, or suspended and taken away at the will of this sovereign. To an unlimited right of taxing them, much may be objected in granting supplies by imposing taxes on the people. The House of Commons is the sole originating and forming agent as to the matter, measure, and time, while the King and Lords only consent. Of this I know no reason, but that assigned Commons Journal 1672. The Commons Act, as granting for the counties and societies whom they represent, though some have no vote in electing them. The property of the copyholder is represented by its lords, and that within a city by the body of freemen in it, who choose the member of Parliament. But how can the Commons represent the property in America, when stated as being without the realm, and no part of any county or city of the same? Can it be said that in imposing taxes, the Commons do not act in virtue of their representing the towns and counties for whom they grant? Or is it true that in granting for these towns and counties which they represent, they do also represent the property of America? If, at the Restoration, the colonies came under the authority and jurisdiction of Parliament, they also became participants of the rights and liberties on which the power of Parliament is founded, as by new acquisitions and improvements, by trade, manufactures, and colonies. The circumstances of the realm must be often changing, and this representative body cannot instantly and equally follow these changes. It must necessarily at times not be an actual representative. Yet, as the principle that no free people ought to be taxed, but by their own consent, is invariable, so the mode of representation has altered, whereas to extend to and suit the mode under which the represented were found to exist. Hence many towns, counties, and even dominions, not previously represented, have, as they acceded to the realm or increased within it, been called to a share in the Common Council, as the counties Palatine of Durham and Chester, and the Dominion of Wales, so that they might be graded with acts and statutes, passed without their consent and contrary to their interest. Footnote: the Act for admitting members from Chester says that taxation and other proceedings of Parliament extending over unrepresentative inhabitants are tyrannical and illegal. End of footnote. And when King Edward planted a colony in Calais with all the privileges of free-born subjects, that colony sent burgesses to Parliament. Parliament has never ceased to be deemed the constitutional representative, and to act as the common council of the whole dominions of the realm, but on the other hand, has always given subjects power to send the representatives, as they have arisen, to an importance and share of influence in the state, which could justify the measure, or, if, as in the case of the American colonies, the foreign acquisitions have been deemed so far separate from the kingdom that they could not be incorporated into any county or city within the realm, and that their state and condition could be little known by Parliament. The governor, council, and representatives of the county assembled have been admitted to make laws and impose taxes respecting that community, although subordinate to the government of the mother country, and not capable to act contrary to it. If government required money for extraordinary services, the requisition of the crown was laid before the assembly by His Majesty's commissioner, the governor. They always enjoyed the liberty of judging by their representatives how internal taxes should be raised within their respective governments, and what was the ability of the inhabitants to pay them. There is good reason for this. The true ground of justice, whereby the Parliament grants supplies, is that they give what is their own, that they lay no tax, which does not affect themselves and their constituents, and that they do not grant from the property of others to ease themselves. Let the statesman apply this reasoning to the state of the colonies. It strongly pleads their exemption from internal taxation by Parliament, but does not conclude their immunity from external taxes. The Charter of Virginia, after having directly fixed the right of payment of subsidies, imposts, and duties from the company to the crown, and having made a grant of the same to the company for 21 years, hath these words, that they shall be free from all subsidies and customs in Virginia for 21 years, and from all taxes and impositions forever, making not only an express distinction in the matter, but in the right. In consequence of this, the charter incorporating them gave the internal government a right of taxing them. The charter of Maryland reserves to the king and his heirs forever imposts, duties, and customs, which the people of that province are by their charter bound to pay. Yet the same charter, distinguishing between internal and external taxation, says, we, our heirs and successors, shall at no time set and make, or cause to be set, any imposition, custom, or taxation on the inhabitants of the said province for their lands, goods, tenements, or chattels within the said province. In the same manner, and almost in the same words, all the charters of incorporation and government make the same distinction, stipulating expressly for the payment of all imposts and duties, according to the law of merchants, but leaving the lands, etc., to be taxed by the several provincial legislatures. The administration of government towards these people has been conducted on this plan for a century and a half, always imposing external and port duties, but never directly laying internal taxes on the colonists for their lands, etc., or on their transactions within the precincts of the jurisdiction of their several territories. The colonies having been used to this distinction by the course and practice of government, having their reasoning marked an essential difference in the nature of the thing. Whatever duty is imposed on any property imported into their country is thus annexed to that property, but is not imposed upon them, either in their rights or persons, until they choose, by purchasing that property with the tax annexed to it, to annex that tax also to themselves. But this they use to consider as an act of their own consent, whereas whatever tax is imposed on any property, which within the precincts of their jurisdiction is immediately and intimately united to their persons and rights, such tax must be paid without any interposition of their own will, till the year 1764. Britain never exerted a right of imposing internal taxes on the colonies till the year 1768. The colonies never did inform, and as of right, claim exemption from port duties laid on by Parliament, though they well knew that these duties made part of the revenue of the customs, which were granted by the Commons of Great Britain to the Crown in support of its government and dignity. When Britain saw that she had exceeded in her power and had advanced beyond this line, the good humor and honor of the nation returned to it. The colonies have now in their turn advanced beyond this line, and if all which they desire is to be placed on the standing on which they were originally put, they also will fall back to it in their turn. This is the only safe line of peace, but if the mutual trust and confidence is destroyed, no other line of pacification remains, than either that the colonies be admitted to the Parliament of Great Britain by a general British Union, or that they have a Parliament of their own under an American Union. There is no other alternative than they be put either in the situation of Scotland or in that of Ireland. The first of these was proposed near 20 years ago, and might then have been easily carried into execution. 10 years ago it was not desperate, but the spirit of this country disdained the idea, and now the colonies, in their turn, will not hear of it, so that the opportunity is lost. If this be the case, and if it is probable that the colonies being let alone will form an American Union, and that being agitated by opposition from without, they will the sooner, the closer, and the firmer coalesce, what remains but to put a British stadtholder, a king's lieutenant, at the head of that union. When the Netherlands separated from the Spanish government, The wise and temperate among them fought to put themselves under the English in this very form. Such has been invariably the course of human affairs, that wherever a country has been originally divided into a number of small, free, independent states, the necessity of a common referee, who has power sufficient over all, to carry into execution these regulations and remedies which are required by all, has always obliged such states to create some one such referee among themselves, or to call in one from without. If this establishment is formed on preconceived modes of policy, the government may be that of law. If it be only dragged into existence by power and force, it must be the government of men, and founded on the deprivation of freedom. If a certain annual income is demanded of the colonies in lieu of protection, it must be so laid in fair and equitable proportions at present, that as the colonies increase, it may so increase, as still always to hold the same proportion. End of section 3. Section 4 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder, by John Erskine. Reflections 5 and 6. 5. Though I cannot fall in with all the sentiments and proposals of this respectable writer, yet in general they merit an attention, which, I am afraid, they are not like to meet with from either party. They who have leisure and opportunity would do well to consider his proofs. Part 1, page 281 to 318, that a revision of the laws of trade, so far as they respect the colonies, and mitigating some of the restrictions of the Navigation Act, would tend to increase the commerce and wealth of the mother country. If the candid, peaceable spirit that appears in his writings on one side, and Mr. Dickinson's essay on the constitutional power of Britain over the colonies, reprinted London 1774, or the other, animated gentlemen of influence on both sides, expedients would soon occur for stopping the calamities of war and restoring mutual confidence and affection to mother country and colonies. It may not be amiss to lay before my readers some of Mr. Dickinson's reasonings in that essay, in confirmation of Mr. Pownell's. Trade was the object of England in encouraging colonies. A love of freedom was the chief motive of the adventurers. They must therefore have been idiots if they had become colonists, on condition that every shilling they gained might lawfully be taken from them, and armed men set over them to govern them in every action. The freedom of a people does not consist in the extent of their commerce, and therefore by restraints on their commerce is not infringed. By making peace or war, the king may open or stop trade as he pleases, or the Briton will continue free. She herself must determine. How she shall trade must be determined by other nations. The right of acquiring depends on others, the right of acquired property solely on the owner. A power of regulating our trade is subject to a natural and constitutional check. Britain cannot injure us by taking away our commerce without immediately hurting herself, but a supreme legislative power over us is a power without check or limit. She might ruin us by it. The injury to herself might be remote and despised by her. The power of regulating our trade, formed on one of these original contracts, which only can be a foundation of just authority, was the only bond that could have held us together. Without such a bond, our general commerce with foreign nations might have been injurious to Britain. It is pled that there are many in Britain not qualified to vote by their property, though possessed of a considerable share, as proprietors of funds, the East India Company, etc., but not to insist that a complete representation was intended by the Constitution, that every defect in the representation is against it, and that a smaller defect can be no argument for a greater. I would observe that though these proprietors, etc., have no right to vote in that capacity, they may have it in another character as freeholders, etc. Even these not entitled to such vote in England, and incapable of obtaining it, have this protection, that representatives and their electors are bound by the laws made, as well as the rest of the people, and the unrepresented living in the same kingdom cannot be affected unless the representatives and their electors are affected also. But the members of a British Parliament, by granting a revenue in America, give not a single penny out of the pockets of the grantors, or their representatives. Nay, they save money to both. Statutes might grind us, while not an elector in England would know or regard our sufferings. The lords who protected on the repeal of the Stamp Act openly avowed that it was the indispensable duty of Parliament to tax the colonies, in order to ease the gentry and people of Britain. Our dispute, therefore, includes more than the present taxes laid upon us. Britain is about 140 millions in debt. If she can pay any part of that debt by taxing us without our consent, she may, if we can raise the money, pay the whole. Hard is our fate, if to escape the character of rebels, we must be degraded into that of slaves. Parliament could have raised more money by stopping the drawbacks which are allowed on some articles upon their exportation from England, than by all the duties laid upon them on their arrival in the colonies. These duties were therefore laid on, not for the sake of the money, but to establish a precedent for taxing the colonies, the fatal consequences of which we could not but dread. It has been urged that President shew a power of internal legislation over us, rightfully vested in Parliament, but submission to unjust sentences proves not a right to pass them. Submission may sometimes be a less evil than opposition, and therefore a duty. But when submission becomes inconsistent with and destructive of the public good, it is equally our duty to oppose, because precedents have been introduced by the inattention or timidity of some, or the cunning and violence of others, and the latter a right to make the former miserable. Do precedents that ought never to have been set repeal the laws of justice, humanity, and equity? Precedents, therefore, to justify perpetual oppression have no force. What would the liberties of Britain have been at this time, if precedents could have been made inconsistent with the Constitution? It is a maxim of law that a bad usage ought to be abolished. The equal distribution of justice and the free enjoyment of property are the great objects of society, and no time, no precedent, no contract can destroy her claims to them. 6. To these observations from Messrs. Parnell and Dickinson, I will subjoin a few extracts from a sensible anonymous writer, who has replied to the New York Farmers' Free Thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress, 1774, and whose ideas in some particulars differ from theirs. The authority of the British Parliament over America would, in all probability, be a more intolerable and oppressive species of despotism than an absolute monarchy. An absolute prince is under no temptation to purchase the favor of one part of his dominions at the expense of another, for it is his interest to treat them all upon the same footing. But lords and commons have a private and separate interest to pursue, and must be wonderfully disinterested if they would not make us bear a very disproportional part of the public burdens, to avoid them as much as possible themselves. The sacrifice of our interest at ease to theirs will be extremely welcome and alluring to them, Nay, they may court the gale of popular favor by laying oppressive impositions on their American vassals, and by that means lessening the burdens of their friends and countrymen. Besides, our dawning splendor is looked upon with a jealous eye, as portentous of approaching independence. Jealousy is a predominant passion of human nature, and wherever it takes place in rulers, they conclude that they have no security for their authority, unless by rendering their subjects abject and dispirited, intimidating and awing them, and as much as possible increasing their own power, and impairing the people's. To effect this in America, our large standing army would be maintained out of our own pockets, under pretense of defending us, but in fact to make our bondage and misery complete. We might soon expect the martial law universally prevalent, and every bulwark of personal safety abolished. A numerous train of court dependents would be created and supported at our own expense. The value of all our possessions, by a complication of extortive methods, would be gradually depreciated till it became a mere shadow. Deplorable is the condition of that people who have nothing else than the wisdom and justice of another people to depend upon. It is by means of their interest we must make other communities promote ours. Without this, we have no security for anything of which they can deprive us, except their good wills, i.e., none at all. It is an invariable maxim that every acquisition of foreign territory is at the absolute disposal of the king, and unless he annex it to the realm, it is no part of it, and if it be once alienated, it can never be united to it again, without the consent of the proprietors. The exclusive regulation of our commerce is a sufficient tribute to Britain for protecting it. The balance of trade is much against us. The profits Britain derives from us every year exceed 2,500,000 sterling. If her protection merited a greater recompense, her just demands might be satisfied without putting it in her power to ruin us. We assent to the exercise of a power which ascertains to Britain a vast annual income. Further aids ought to be left to that loyalty, fidelity, and generosity which the colonies, especially Massachusetts, that injured calumniated county, so signally displayed, in sparing neither men nor money in the last war. Parliaments legislating for us and raising a revenue upon the articles of commerce would be a sufficient degree of slavery. It is absurd to say that Britain could not impose heavy burdens on our commerce without immediately feeling the effect herself. She may enrich herself by reducing us to penury and wretchedness. We are already forbid to purchase the manufactures of any foreign countries. If we might manufacture our own materials, that might be a refuge to us, and a security against any immoderate exactions. But this too might be prohibited. We should then be under an inevitable necessity to purchase goods from Britain that we could not do without, however excessive duties were laid upon them. And Britain would be enriched by draining us of all our wealth. But these necessaries. As to our trade with foreign countries, the burdens imposed on that increase her public treasure. Her inhabitants would pay no part of them. They fall solely upon us. The encumbrances of our foreign trade would not injure hers. In a period not far distant, the productions of our country will infinitely exceed the demands which Britain can have for them, and as we shall then be greatly advanced in population, our wants will be proportionately increased. These circumstances will open an ample field for extortion and oppression. Tyrannical edicts would always be ready to silence our murmurs. A formidable army would be kept up to enforce them. The slightest struggles to recover our lost liberty would become dangerous and even capital. Continental conventions, by which there might be a communion of counsels and measures, would be interdicted. Non-importation and non-exportation agreements would be made treasonable. No remedy would be left but in the clemency of our oppressors. a wretched one indeed, and such as no prudent man would confide in. I have not time to transcribe the evidence adduced by this writer, pages 25 to 38, that parliamentary claims of taxation have no support in any of the charters, except that of Philadelphia, in which there is reserve in favor of Parliament, which must either be rejected, interpreted of duties for the regulation of trade, not internal taxations, or the general tenor of the grant become unintelligible. King James granted to the Company of New Plymouth all jurisdictions, royalties, etc., within a certain tract of land and the adjacent islands and seas, reserving only the 5th part of all gold and silver ore, in lieu of all duty, demand, and services. The council was vested with the sole power of legislation, coinage, making war and peace, etc. The inhabitants a few years after purchased these rights from the patentees and became an independent state by charter. King Charles I granted to the Company of Massachusetts Bay powers and privileges resembling those of New Plymouth. The Connecticut and Rhode Island charters granted by Charles II reserve only allegiance to the king, without the smallest share of the legislative or executive powers. The Massachusetts colony did not accept their new charter for William and Mary, till advised by the best civilians that their religious liberties were forever secured, and that they could be touched by no tax or law, but of their own making. This, and what has been formerly observed on the same subject from Governor Parnell, shews that claims from charters to exemption from taxation are not, as Dr. J., Mr. W., and others give out, peculiar to Maryland. The temporary exemption from taxes in Massachusetts Bay refers to quit rents for lands, which exemption is commonly granted for a certain number of years to the first settlers in every new colony, and therefore Mr. Mott Dewitt, Dr. J., and others have been too hasty in concluding that the Massachusetts colony, by accepting the charters of James and Charles I, freeing them from taxes for 7 years, virtually stipulated to pay taxes after the expiration of that period. End of section 4. Section 5 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder by John Erskine. Reflections 7 to 10. 7. Still further evidence may be had what claims would probably have been insisted on, and what concessions made by the colonies from the resolutions and instructions of the Provincial Congress in Pennsylvania, 15th July, 1774. There they ask Britain's renouncing all powers of internal legislation, of imposing taxes internal or external, and of regulating trade, except with respect to new articles of commerce, which the colonies may hereafter raise, and the repeal of the acts of the former session of Parliament respecting Massachusetts Bay, and then say, it will be reasonable for the colonies to settle a certain annual revenue on His Majesty, subject to the control of Parliament, and to satisfy all damages done to the East India Company. From Britain alone we shall continue to receive manufactures. To her alone we shall continue to carry the many articles of commerce, the exportation of which her policy hath thought fit to confine to herself. With such parts of the world only as she hath appointed us to deal, we shall continue to deal, and such commodities as she hath permitted us to bring from them, we shall continue to bring. The executive and controlling powers of the Crown will retain their full force in operation, We shall contentedly labor for Britain as affectionate friends in time of tranquillity, and cheerfully spend for her, as dutiful children, our treasures in blood in time of war. She will receive from us a certain income without the trouble and expense of collecting. The officers employed by Britain consume a large part of what she takes from us. We could raise the same sum in a much more easy, equal, and cheap manner. Our barracks cost £8,000 of this money, and the barracks of another place, not deserving a comparison with ours, cost £40,000 sterling. If money is raised upon us by Parliament, of £1,000 taken out of our pockets, not 100 will be usefully applied to the service of the Crown. The interruption of our commerce must distress many of our fellow subjects at home, and therefore we request that our deputies exert themselves to induce the Continental Congress to make a full and precise state of grievances, and a decent yet firm claim of redress, and to wait the event before any other step is taken. Probably Pennsylvania in general would have gladly accepted these, or even in some articles, less favorable terms of accommodation, and it may be presumed New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Georgia would not have risen higher in their demands, and that the united influence must have great effect on the other colonies. 8. It hath been alleged that all the claims of the colonies to an exclusive right of taxing themselves took their rise from the conquest of Canada. Perhaps it might be said with greater truth that the idea of Parliament taxing them was suggested by certain gentlemen employed in America during the late war, and desirous of procuring for themselves or relations offices in the army or customs in that country. But American ideas of taxation were much the same in the last as in the present century, only the regard paid to them by government was then greater. The governor of New York very early imposed 10% on all goods imported at the whore kill, though neither that nor West Jersey was legally under his jurisdiction. The settlers from the first complained of the hardship, but bore it with tolerable patience till about 1680, when application was made to the Duke of York, who referred to the matter to the council, where it was reported in their favor, and the duty ordered to be discontinued. Among the arguments in the paper presented to the Duke's commissioners against the customs were these: if we could not assure people of an easy, free, and safe government, both with respect to their spiritual and worldly property, that is, an uninterrupted liberty of conscience, and an inviolable possession of their civil rights and freedoms, by a just and wise government, a mere wilderness would be no encouragement, for it were madness to leave a free, good, and improved country, to plant in a wilderness, and there adventure many thousands of pounds to give an absolute title to another person to tax us at will and pleasure. You plead that Jersey was a conquered country, and that the king, being the conqueror, had power to raise money, make law, etc., and that this power he had vested in the Duke, by right of which he demands that custom we complain of. But suppose the king were a conqueror, did his power extend equally over his own English people as over the conquered? Are not they some of the letters that make up the word conqueror? Shall a people free by law, under their prince at home, be at his mercy in the plantations abroad? The king's grant to the Duke of York is plainly restricted to the laws and government of England, in the constitution of which it is fundamental that the king cannot take his subjects' goods without their consent. See Magna Carta, Chapter 29, 34th Edward III, Chapter 2, and 25th Edward, Chapter 7. To give up the power of making laws is to sell, or rather to resign ourselves to the will of another for nothing. For we buy nothing of the Duke, if not the right of an undisturbed colonizing, with no diminution of the privileges enjoyed in our own country. For the soil is none of his, it is the natives'. This tax is not to be found in the Duke's conveyances, but is an after business. Had the planters foreseen it, they would sooner have taken up in any other plantation in America. New Jersey never paid custom before the last piece, and that piece reinvests every proprietor by articles. We bought it when free, since which time this imposition is born. The plain English of the tragedy is this. We twice buy this moiety of New Jersey, first of Lord Berkeley, and then of the natives. And for what? The better to mortgage ourselves and our posterity to the Duke's governors, and give them a title to our persons and estates that never had any before, since by this precedent we are assessed without any law, and excluded our English right of common assent to taxes. What security have we of anything we possess? We can call nothing our own, but our tenants at will, not only for the soil, but for all our personal estates, while we endure penury and the sweat of our brows to improve them at our own hazard only. The curious may find this spirited memorial inserted at large in Sam Smith's History of New Jersey, published at Burlington, 1765, pages 116 to 125. The proprietors of East and West Jersey surrendered A.D. 1702 to Queen Anne their right of government, without any intention to abridge the privileges before enjoyed, among which were freedom of conscience, trial by juries in open court, taxes to be levied only by legislative act, etc. And indeed these privileges they could not lawfully abridge, for the settlers had purchased them, as well as the soil, and therefore, without their own deed, could not warrantably be divested of them. Yet attempts were early made to encroach on these rights. Lord Cornbury arrived in New Jersey, of which he was appointed governor, August 1703. Among Queen Anne's instructions to him, the 69 and 70 were that Episcopal churches should be built at the common charge throughout the government, and the 99, that no person shall keep a press for printing, and that no book or pamphlet should be printed without the governor's license. It was not alleged that this restriction was necessary to remedy actual disorders. All the pretext for it was that great inconvenience might arise by the liberty of printing in that province. Possibly his lordship was himself the suggester of these instructions. Be that as it may, his oppressive and arbitrary conduct soon rendered him detested both there and in New York. In A.D. 1708, Queen Anne listened to the cries of her injured subjects and recalled him. The three succeeding governors, Lord Lovelace, Brigadier Hunter, and William Burnet, sought the good of the people and were esteemed and regarded. See Smith's History, page 208 to 355. 9. What hath been extracted from the West Jersey Memorial equally confutes the charge against Chatham, Camden, Mr. Burke, etc., of having taught the colonies to oppose the Parliament's right of taxing them. Besides, as the Provincial Congress in Pennsylvania observed, the opposition in America to the Stamp Act was fully formed before it was known there that their cause was espoused by any man of note at home. 10. But is it just, when Britain hath expended such enormous sums in defending America, that America should refund no part of them? I might reply by asking whether Britain was at this expense for the sake of the colonies or for her own, whether she could have avoided it without enabling France and Spain to ruin her trade and naval power, and to make her as contemptible as the success of the late war made her glorious. Whether, if one corner of our empire suffers the calamities of war, it is equitable and generous to deprive that corner, by new and unprecedented taxations, of the joys of peace. Were not many of the colonies settled, defended, and governed at their own expense? Or the mother country till the commencement of the last war was put to a trifling charge, or to none at all, for these purposes. Had it been otherwise, was the profit of 2 millions a year by the American trade no recompense to Britain for protecting it? Or does it contribute nothing to the balance accounts between the mother country and colonies, that the latter are prohibited to go to any market north of Cape Finisterre in the Kingdom of Spain, and thus are constrained to sell commodities which Britain will not take from them, twice as cheap, and to purchase goods with which she cannot supply them, twice as dear, as they otherwise might? Nay, that they dare not make a hat for themselves of their own furs, and must send their iron to be manufactured in Britain, heavy as that article is, and necessary in every branch of husbandry. Has it not been pled that the late war was undertaken rather in defense of the new plantation of Nova Scotia, which has no concern in the present dispute, than of the elder colonies? And yet did not some of these last exert themselves in that war so much beyond what could have been justly required, that Parliament thought it just to make them large reimbursements? Why then disoblige them by interposing the authority of Parliament to procure from them grants which, when necessary, they had cheerfully made of their own accord? Without such constraint, at least in the Massachusetts colony, the burden of the late war was more severely felt than at home. Let me transcribe a curious account of this matter from Dr. Chauncey's Thanksgiving sermon for the repeal of the Stamp Act, reprinted, London, 1767, page 11. Note: I have been assured by a gentleman of reputation and fortune in Boston that in the late war he sent one of his rate bills to a correspondent of note in London for his judgment on it, and had this answer returned from his friend, that he did not believe there was a man in all England who paid so much in proportion towards the support of the government. It will render the above accounts and more easily credible if I inform the reader that I have lately and purposely conversed with one of the assessors of this town, who has been annually chosen by them into this office for a great number of years, for which reason he may be thought a person of integrity, and one that may be depended on, and he declares to me that the assessment upon this town, particularly in one of the years when the tax on account of the war was great, was as follows: on personal estate, 13 shillings and 4 pence on the pound. That is, if a man's income from money at interest, or in any other way, was 60 pounds per annum, he was assessed 60 times 13 shilling and 4 pence, and in this proportion, whether the sum was more or less. On real estate, the assessment was at the rate of 6 years' income. That is, if a man's house or land was valued at 200 pounds per annum income, this 200 pounds was multiplied by 6, amounting to 1,200 pounds. That is, 72 pounds was the sum he was obliged to pay. Besides this, the rate upon every man's poll, and the polls of all the males in his house upward of 16 years of age, was about 19 shillings lawful money, which is only 1/4 part short of sterling. Over and above all this, they paid their part of an excise that was laid on tea, coffee, rum, and wine, amounting to a very considerable sum. How it was in the other provinces or in the other towns, of this I know not, but it may be relied on as fact that this was the tax levied in Boston, and has been great ever since, though not so enormously so as at that time. Every one may now judge whether we had not abundant reason for mournful complaint, when in addition to the vast sums, considering our numbers and abilities, we were obliged to pay, we were loaded with the Stamp Act, which would in a few years have taken away all our money, and rendered us absolutely incapable either of supporting the government here, or of carrying on any sort of commerce, unless by an exchange of commodities. End of section 5.
Section 6 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rutger. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder by John Erskine. Reflections 11 and 12. Reflection 11. Can the Americans with a good grace complain of tyranny in the mother country for imposing an easy and inconsiderable tax, whilst they themselves are rioting on the labor of thousands of their species, torn from their dearest relations and doomed to abject and perpetual slavery? In answer to this objection, it may be asked, where did this infamous commerce originate? Where is it still carried on with all the eagerness which avarice can inspire? Where but in England? By what means can it be abolished? Surely by that power alone which America acknowledges the parent state may justly exercise over all her dominion, that is, the power of regulating their trade. The legislatures of some of the colonies have done what they could to put a stop to the importation of African slaves by loading it with the heaviest duties, and others have attempted the total abolition of it by acts of assembly which their governors refused to pass. And though they then petitioned for new instructions to their governors on this head, after all they failed of success. Reflection 12. Granting that some of the American claims are plausible, has not their licentious, insolent, and abusive conduct in their manner of prosecuting them merited the severities inflicted by Parliament? The colonies are part of the British Empire, and therefore had no right to prohibit the importing the produce or merchandise of any other part of it. The obstructing such importation, and much more the destroying goods so imported, when the gentler step of not purchasing them might have answered the same end, was a contempt of government, and an act of injustice not to be tolerated. That a disorderly, ungovernable spirit hath appeared in the colonies is too true. It should, however, be remembered that it hath been raised and cherished by passing and enforcing laws judged them inconsistent with their liberty. Before the unhappy Stamp Act, there was not a more peaceable and loyal people than they were in the whole British Empire. They rejoiced in the friendship and protection of the parent state, and gloried in her prosperity. Their attachment to British fashions and manufactures was extravagant, and every penny they could raise was spent that way, which the exchange against them proves. But during the non-importation agreement occasioned by the Stamp Act, the exchange fell 16 or 17% below par. In New England, civil government was carried on with peculiar order and regularity, and greater care taken than perhaps in any other country of the morals and religious conduct of the people, so that if one of the highest rank had dared to swear and blaspheme in the streets, as the meanest common soldier often does in other places, he would have been sent to jail. In Connecticut there were not, for a score of years, above 3 instances of capital punishments. These halcyon days are indeed past, and the conduct of the colonies in consequence of the Tea Act hath afforded their enemies a wished-for and specious pretext for endeavoring to strip them of some of their most valuable privileges. But while we blame where we must, let us also be candid where we can, and coolly consider what hath been pled to alleviate acts of violence which it were to be wished had never been committed. And here I will take the liberty to transcribe part of a letter to a gentleman from a correspondent with whom he had expostulated on that subject. Quote, You don't reflect that allowing the landing of tea would have implied a submission to and admission of the Act of Parliament which the principal part of America had been opposing. On landing the tea, the duty became payable, and the payment would have been express acknowledgment of a right in Parliament to tax Americans. It is true, though the tea were landed, people were under no necessity of purchasing it. But you forget that by the act, importation is the circumstance which makes the tea liable to duty, and upon the importation the duty must be paid by one or other, whether there is or is not a purchaser. Had the tea been landed, the East India Company would have been liable for the American duty, and the people suffering it to be landed would have tacitly consented to the payment of the duty and so admitted the act, and with all its consequences. But as there was no importation without a landing, by preventing the latter, they prevented the former, and thus got rid of the act. Indeed, even if the duty had been payable only in case of a purchase, it would not have been advisable to permit the landing of the tea, for a reason which the least acquaintance with human nature will suggest. As to the mode by which landing the tea was prevented at Boston, you may be assured the people there are not so culpable as they have been represented, if they are culpable at all. When the tea ship arrived, the committee met, determined that the tea should be returned to the East India Company, sent to the consignees, and informed them of this determination, and then applied to the owners of the vessel, who agreed to her going back with the tea, and to the custom-house officers, who said they would give a clearance, when all the dutiable articles were out. Application was then made to Governor Hutchinson for a let pass, for the vessel being in Boston harbor had to pass the castle in order to go to sea, which she could not be allowed to do without a let pass, i.e., a permission in writing from the governor, which being shown to the officers of the customs is a warrant to them for clearing the vessel. The governor refused this request, so that the vessel could not go out of the harbor. If the tea had remained on board the vessel in the harbor, by a former act of Parliament, it would have been subject to the duty, and liable to be seized and kept by the custom house for security of the payment of it. This time was nearly expired, and there was a report that the custom-house officers would immediately seize the tea. Some zealous friends of the colonies, perceiving no alternative but to give up their own liberties and betray those of all America, or to destroy the tea, in this unhappy dilemma of two evils, chose what appeared to be to them the least, the destruction of the tea. Indeed, they cannot be said to have chosen what they were compelled to by the obstinacy of their governor, on whom the blame ought to be laid, and not on a virtuous, oppressed people. Besides, the town of Boston cannot be justly charged with destroying the tea. Indeed, almost all the inhabitants of Boston opposed the Tea Act, but the destruction was made by a few, and whether these few were Bostonians or even New Englanders, there is no evidence. New England's being a part of the British Empire gives no more title to the East India Company to force tea upon them than it gives to them to land hats in England. It cannot be thought strange that every colony used the most probable means of preserving her natural and charter rights. If necessity constrained them to measures not agreeable, the authors of that necessity, not those constrained by it, must bear the larger share of the blame." End of section 6.
Section 7 of the Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder by John Erskine. Reflections 13 and 14. 13. But though these apologies should be supposed weak, it will not be easy to show the equity and expedience of the acts of the subsequent session of Parliament, founded on these proceedings. The Boston Port Bill condemns the whole town unheard, nay, uncited to answer, involves thousands in ruin and misery, without suggestion of any crime by them committed, and is so constructed that enormous pains and penalties must ensue, notwithstanding the most perfect obedience to its injunctions. Have not other cities been repeatedly affected by popular commotions? Whence then is Boston devoted to such unexampled treatment? Had Parliament evidence? Did they even suggest that Boston as a town aided, abetted, and participated in these tumults? The records of Boston and known facts prove that the inhabitants discountenanced and disavowed all riot and disorder. At the last town meeting relative to the East India Tea, it was debated whether the committee appointed to wait on the consignees should be instructed to insist on their peremptory answer, whether they would send back the tea, and it passed by a large majority in the negative. And yet the destruction of the tea, which took place without any illegal procedure of the town, is the only alleged ground of consigning thousands of its inhabitants to ruin, misery, and despair. If a ship shall be seen hovering within the bay, or within 1 league of it, any commissioned officer of the fleet or customs may compel it to depart to such harbor or station as he shall appoint. They are not limited even to harbors on the American continent. If they appoint such a station, it is favor, and what price malice, pride, or avarice may set on that favor, who can tell? Another clause in this statute voids all contracts for carrying goods to and from Boston Harbor, which have been made or shall be made, as long as the Act continues in force, relating to any ship which shall arrive in said harbor after 1st June. Retrospective or post facto statutes have been always deemed opposite to sound morals and political wisdom. How much more when they involve and distress innocent subjects, or to the natives of other states. One has contracted to send merchandise to Boston, and when he has fulfilled his contract, is not only disappointed of the commodities he expected in return, but even of indemnification from the Boston merchant, his contract being declared to all intents and purposes null. What malignant evil justified such indiscriminate vengeance? These charged with the most aggravated crimes are not punishable till arraigned before disinterested judges, heard in their own defense, and found guilty of the charge. But here a whole people are accused, prosecuted by they not know whom, tried they know not when, proved guilty they not know how, and sentenced to suffer inevitable ruin. Their hard fate cannot be averted by the most servile submission, the most implicit obedience to this statute. Their first intimation of it was 10th May, and it took place 1st June, thence to continue in full force till it shall sufficiently appear to His Majesty that full satisfaction hath been made by, or in behalf of, the inhabitants of Boston, to the East India Company, for the damage sustained by the destruction of their tea, and until it shall be certified to His Majesty by the Governor or Lieutenant Governor of said province, that reasonable satisfaction has been made to the officers of the revenue, and others, for the riots and insurrection above mentioned. What time must elapse for the town calling a meeting to consult and determine upon the measure? For dispatches to England, application to the East India Company, an adjustment with them on the nice point of full satisfaction, and for making the matter sufficiently appear to his Majesty. All this done, still they could have no relief till the governor certified to his Majesty that reasonable satisfaction has been made to the officers of the revenue. Litigations here would arise, none being appointed to judge between the subjects and these officers, or if the governor be the implied judge, no direction given how the question should be brought before him, tried and adjusted, and the Bostonians not being like speedily to procure certificates from such governors as B or H, or to rest in their decisions, so short a space is given for staying this torrent of evils, that the subject, though exerting his utmost energy, must be overwhelmed and driven to madness by terms of deliverance, which deny relief till their ruin is irretrievable. By 4th William and Mary, c. 13, towns in Massachusetts province cannot raise or appropriate any moneys, except to the support of the ministry, schools, and poor, and the defraying of other necessary town charges. The clause, necessary town charges, cannot include the moneys appointed to be paid to the East India House. The town did not contract that debt, and when our provincial legislatures made the above law and procured for it the royal approbation, they could have no such charge in view. The town therefore cannot make provision for paying that money, without breach of a law neither suspended nor repealed. Parliament having made no new act to enable them to assess themselves for that purpose, and yet, if they don't pay the money, their ruin is inevitable. The act does not suggest that the East India Company had made any demand for damage done their property, much less that they had alleged any charge against the town of Boston as guilty. Whatever may be the claim of that company, by not prosecuting, they are supposed to waive it. This is the first instance where Parliament has ordered one subject to make satisfaction to another, when the party aggrieved does not appear to make his regular claim, and much more uncommon is it for such recompense to be ordered without ascertaining the amount to which the satisfaction should extend. Suppose the East India Company and officers of the revenue were made perfectly easy. Who can say how many others would suggest that they suffered by the riots and insurrections above mentioned, demand what they termed reasonable satisfaction, and thus, by introducing endless litigations, make a full compliance with the requisitions of the act impracticable, and of course render permanent its ruinous consequences. The above reasonings are extracted from Mr. Quincy's observations on the Boston Port Bill, published at London 1774. To them I will add a few further observations on the same act by T.W., a Bostonian, published at Boston 1774. The support of at least 8/10 of the inhabitants of Boston depends on trade. Laborers and artificers of almost every denomination, with their wives, children, and dependents, who at the lowest computation may amount to 15,000, are reduced to a starving condition, none of which, so far as is known, had any more hand in the destruction of the tea than Lord North, and few of whom were among these who constituted the assemblies that have been complained of as riotous. This is the case of our shipbuilders, mast makers, riggers, caulkers, rope and sail makers, of our house carpenters and masons, who have now little to do, as timber, brick, lime, etc., are not permitted to be landed in our harbor, of our distillers and sugar boilers, as no molasses nor sugar are suffered to come there, or our coopers, even if they could procure staves and hoops, as the work of trimming imported caulks, and making others for exportation is at a period, of our truckmen, porters, and numerous train of day laborers, who must now suffer hunger, and be clothed with rags. Nay, the sufferings occasioned by this act extend to all towns on the seashore for hundreds of miles, whose business is that of coasting, as they are restrained from bringing to this port any merchandise or carrying any out of it, however necessary for them. No merchandise is permitted to be brought even from Marblehead or Salem, the port substituted in the room of Boston, but by land carriage, which, though greatly expensive, is made almost doubly so, as instead of 15 miles only by going over a ferry, the necessary carriage is now no less than 28, which is as distressing to the merchants in these towns as to those in Boston, as thereby deprived of a market for much the largest part of their West India imports. Had punishment but only threatened, had it been at our own option, whether we would submit or suffer, the reason for complaint would have been less. But without previous warning, in the proposal of any terms that might have prevented the coming of evil upon us, it is inflicted with ineffable vengeance, so that should we servilely submit to all required, we must notwithstanding suffer almost total ruin. The conditions upon which alone our sufferings are to be removed, far from being fixed with precision, are so loose and indeterminate that a governor may, should he so please, perpetuate them during his political existence, the king and council not being enabled to open the port without a certificate. The wharves and landing places in Boston, which are the property of numerous individuals, and of a much greater value than all the teas the East India Company have sent to this whole continent, are, as to the use of them, wherein only their value consists, wrested out of their hands and put into the king's, to be disposed of at his pleasure. The plea for this extraordinary vengeance is dangerous commotions and insurrections in the town of Boston, but has not been as much the case in the city of London. Yet that city was never punished for these riotous disorders, much less with the severity portending its destruction. Would Boston have been thus cruelly dealt with, had not its distance from Britain been so great, that its groans could not be heard there, whereas to move indignation or compassion in our brethren? It has been well observed in the Lord's protest against the Regulating Act, that the legal condition of the subject, standing unattained by conviction for treason or felony, ought never to depend on the arbitrary will of any person whatever. Yet the shutting up Boston Harbor does not determine on payment of a fine for an offense, or a compensation for an injury, but is to continue till the Privy Council think fit to revoke it. The author of a summary view of the rights of British America, printed Williamsburg, 1774, takes notice that, though 2 wharves in Boston are to be opened again, when His Majesty shall think proper, the residue which lined the extensive shores of the Bay of Boston are forever interdicted the exercise of commerce, so that the trade which cannot be received at 2 wharves alone must, of necessity, be transferred to some other place. 14. By the Regulating Act, a governor may prevent all town meetings except these, for choosing town officers and representatives. No other business, however trifling or important, can be legally transacted, even in the most distant towns, so as to bind the inhabitants without leave obtained in writing from the governor, expressing such special business, though it should happen that if not done in less time than necessary for that leave, it cannot be done at all. Without such leave, they cannot settle a minister, lay out a new road, or raise money for mending an old one. Yea, they are forbidden to treat, i.e., to talk of any other matter than the election of officers at the March meeting and the business expressed in the governor's leave at the other meetings. Should a governor's favorite embezzle the town's money? Should an inspired candidate for a vacant church be reported as a warm friend of liberty? Should an oppressed town be desirous of stating its grievances and seeking redress? Should electors incline to instruct their representatives on matters of the highest concern? The governor's interest may prevent his giving them leave to act in their corporate capacity. All the towns of the colony are reduced to this slavish dependence, because, it is said, town meetings have been abused, matters of general concern treated on in them, and many dangerous and unwarrantable resolves passed. It is not alleged that they have done this wilfully and perversely. It is only said that they have been foolishly misled, and yet on that account they must be deprived of their liberties. Administration on the same pretext, and as equitably, might suspend every American assembly, might ease itself of the opposition of the city of London by a like regulation of their charter, nay, might prevent all corporation and country meetings in Britain, that they might be pestered with no future petitions or remonstrances. Nay, as the protesting lords observed, the governor and council thus entrusted with power, with which the Constitution has not trusted his Majesty, and his Privy Council, have the means of returning such juries as may suit the gratification of their passions and interest. The lives, liberties, and properties of the subject are put into their hand without control, and the invaluable right of trial by jury is turned into a snare for the people, who have hitherto looked upon it as their main security from the licentiousness of power. The Act for the impartial administration of justice, etc., is no better calculated to convince the Americans that their lives and properties are safe in the hand of Parliament, and to recommend implicit submission to their authority. The Americans are, by their charters, invested with the immunities of Englishmen, to be tried by the peers of the vicinage in one of these immunities. Therefore, an act which declares that an American accused of a crime committed within the precincts of his colony may, if the governor pleases, be brought over to Britain to take his trial, militates against the Constitution and common law, which the three legislative bodies are solemnly bound to maintain inviolable. The witnesses, too, however their health may be impaired, or their life endangered by a long voyage and change of climate, and whatever their wives and families may suffer by the want of their labor, yet, on the receipt of such a sum as the governor shall think reasonable for them to expend, are to enter into recognizance to appear at the trial. End of section 7. Section 8 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a freeholder, by John Erskine. Reflections 15 and 16. 15. Equally exceptionable in the Quebec Act, while Canada was under the dominion of France, her despotic laws, which exposed the lives and properties of subjects to continual depredations from the malice and avarice of those in authority, were enforced there. But when it was conquered by Britain, His Majesty, by proclamation, promised to all who should settle there a full enjoyment of the rights of British subjects. Notwithstanding this, the Quebec Act annuls and makes void the said proclamation, and the government hitherto established in consequence of it, though the people of Canada at large never expressed a discontent with their new establishment, or solicited a restoration of their old, nay, by the best intelligence, were averse to the change. However this may be, the French laws and customs in all matters of property and civil rights are revived, until they shall be varied and altered by any ordinances passed in the said province by the governor and council. Thus the ancient laws of Canada are restored, liable to such variations and additions as shall be deemed necessary by the governor and council, and as both the one and the other are appointed by the king during pleasure, they will be his creatures, and the civil rights and properties of the Canadians made altogether dependent on his will, because the power of altering them by new ordinances is unlimited. The king has only to inform the governor and council what new laws he would choose to have passed, and the situation will ensure their compliance. It is also provided that nothing in the act shall hinder his majesty, his heirs and successors, from erecting from time to time such courts criminal, civil, and ecclesiastical, and appointing from time to time the judges and officers thereof, as they shall judge necessary, so that the prince's prerogative enables him, if he inclines, to establish the most iniquitous, cruel, and oppressive courts, and to appoint temporary judges and officers, whom he can displace and change as often as he pleases. The criminal laws of England are indeed established, but that important privilege is rendered uncertain by a clause which makes them subject to such alterations and amendments as the governor, with the advice of the council, shall from time to time cause to be made therein. Under this notion, the king, through the medium of his creatures, the governor and council, may entirely new mold the criminal laws of Canada, and make them subservient to the most tyrannical views. It has been denied that the right of trial by juries is taken from the Canadians, and pled that their provincial legislature may introduce them when they please, and it is expected will, as soon as the inhabitants desire, and the state of the country admits it. But a civil right is that which law and constitution confer, not that which may be derived from the arbitrary bounty of those in authority. The possibility that the legislature of Canada may hereafter introduce trials by juries does not imply a right in the people to enjoy them. Thus, by this act, the whole legislative, executive, and judiciary powers are ultimately and effectually, though not immediately, lodged with the king. By the same act, the Church of Rome has the sanction of a legal establishment in the province of Quebec, provision being made not only for the protection, but for the permanent support of popery, by the clause that the clergy of the Church of Rome may hold, receive, and enjoy their accustomed dues and rights, etc. Much stress has been laid on the word may, as a bare permission to the clergy to enjoy their usual emoluments. But if they may, if they please, there must be a corresponding obligation on their parishioners to pay these dues when required. What the law gives an unconditional permission to enjoy, no person can legally withhold from us. It becomes our property, and we can enforce our right to it. Tithes in Canada, it is said, are the property of the Romish Church, and permitting a tolerated church to enjoy its own property is far short of the idea of an establishment. Certainly, previous to the surrender of Canada, the Catholic religion was established there by the laws of France, and tithes were, on that account, the legal property of the Church of Rome, and could not be withheld by the laity, though ever so much disposed to it. But after the surrender, the French laws being no longer in force, the establishment of the Romish Church and her property in tithes ceased, of course. It is true, the clergy may have continued to enjoy them, but it was at the discretion of the laity to withhold or abridge them if they thought proper. But by the late act, the Church of Rome is restored to her former legal claim to tithes, which she before received only from the voluntary bounty of her proselytes. The characteristic difference between the tolerated and established religion is this. With respect to the support of the former, the law is positive and improvident, leaves it to those who profess it to make as much or as little provision as they judge expedient, and to vary that provision as they please. But with respect to the support of the latter, the law is active and provident. Certain specific dues, tithes, etc., are annexed to the clerical office, independent on the will of the people, which is exactly the case with the Canadian priests, and therefore no impartial man will doubt the popery is established in Canada. It is often asserted that ample provision has been made by the Act for the future establishment of the Protestant religion, and indeed after the clause that the clergy of the Church of Rome may hold, receive, and enjoy their accustomed dues and rights. This clause follows, provided nevertheless that it shall be lawful for his majesty, his heirs and successors, to make such provision out of the rest of the said accustomed dues and rights, for the encouragement of the Protestant religion, for the maintenance and support of a Protestant clergy within the said province, as he or they shall from time to time think necessary and expedient. But when the Romish clergy receive their accustomed dues, where shall we find the rest or remainder, which is to be applied for encouraging Protestantism? Besides, had there been really provision made to be applied at the discretion of His Majesty, still no Protestant would consent to let the free exercise of his religion depend on the mere pleasure of any man, as thus it must be rendered insecure and precarious. Yet by this act it is in the King's power to keep the Protestants of Canada forever dispossessed of all religious immunities. If this act were justifiable in relation to the province of Quebec, within its ancient limits, there is no pretext for it when considered as annexing so boundless an extent of new territory to the old, and placing the whole under the same exceptional institutions, civil and religious. The present policy of the Act is this: by giving a legal sanction to the accustomed dues of the priests, it was intended to interest them in behalf of administration, and by means of all the dominion they possess over the minds of the laity, together with the appearance of goodwill towards their religion, to prevent any dissatisfaction which might arise from the loss of their civil rights, and to gain their assistance in subjugating the other colonies. The future police of it demands particular attention. The nature of civil government will hereafter put a stop to emigrations from other parts of the British dominions thither, and from all other free countries, and the advantages secured to popery discourage all Protestants, so that the province will be settled and inhabited by none but papists. If lenity and moderation are observed in administering the laws, the natural advantages of this fertile infant country, united to the indulgence given to their religion, will attract droves of emigrants from all the Roman Catholic states in Europe, and thus the old colonies in time will find themselves encompassed with a numerous host of neighbors, disaffected to them, both because of difference in religion and government. How dangerous their situation would be, let every man of common sense judge. 16. How important it is to Britain that Protestantism should prevail in the colonies, and what danger there is of the contrary, let me set before my readers, from the most respectable and unexceptional authorities, Archbishop Cornwallis's sermon before the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, 20th February 1756, page 17. I do not see how our colonies, situated as they are, and little able by their own means to provide themselves pastors and instructors, are likely to continue in the Protestant principles without our aid and liberality. For the papists lying always in wait to deceive, creeping into every house, and leading captive the ignorant and unwary, have a fair opportunity of instilling their doctrines, and seldom fail of success, in places where religion is either made a matter of indifference, or where there is a failure of such persons as are fitted to counteract their designs, and to prevent the poison of their insinuations. And if our colonies change their communion, we shall be in great danger of losing the fruits of their industry. For a forsaking their Protestant principles will necessarily terminate in exchange of their allegiance, and if they quit our faith, they will leave us little hope of retaining their friendship. And we may say, in general, without any offense against charity, and without any severity of judgment, that it is as difficult to conceive how a sincere papist can be a good subject in a Protestant nation, as it is to conceive how a person can be faithful to our interest who looks upon it as a duty to act in opposition to it. Bishop Ellis's Society Sermon, 1759, page 28. If by such means the number of papists should much increase in the British colonies, there would be so many more certain enemies to the interest of the nation, in which case they would either endeavor to throw off their dependence upon it, or would betray and give up the colonies to a neighboring power. Our enemy there, as well as in Europe, who always will be ready to receive and support them, as the great importance of those colonies to this kingdom is now understood, it is easy to conceive what their loss would be to us, especially should they come into the possession of an enemy solicitous to impair, and as far as possible, ruin our commerce, who therefore would improve all advantages which these colonies might afford to the height against us, perhaps so far as to become at length superior to us in maritime power, in which case the way would be visibly open to our final destruction. Bishop Terrick's Society Sermon, 1764, page 28. The toleration of the free exercise of the popish religion in the conquered countries, however it may reflect honor on the lenity and moderation of our principles, calls for all our caution to guard against that zeal and bigotry which will watch every opportunity of making converts among those with whom they must have a constant intercourse, by living under the same government, and of infusing into the neighboring Indian tribes, too readily disposed by their natural rudeness and barbarity to be savage and cruel in their manners, the spirit of a religion which will give an edge to every revengeful and inhuman passion, and teach them to be our most dangerous and destructive enemies from principle. State of the Society from 1766 to February 1767, page 47. The Reverend Mr. Morrow, the Society's missionary to the French at Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, writes that the Indians had shown him the copy of a letter, which they are told was written by Jesus Christ to the Bishop of Lucan in France to be sent to them. It is signed by two persons, who say they have received it from the said bishop to be distributed among the savages. Each of them has a copy of it, which they wear next to their heart. The letter is filled with the greatest absurdities imaginable. They are therein threatened with eternal damnation if they fail in any point of the Romish religion, and, on the contrary, are promised eternal happiness if they separate from these of a different opinion. They are never to die a sudden death, nor be drowned, nor perish in war, so long as they have their letter next to their heart. Ib, page 50. Mr. Bailey, the Society's itinerant missionary on the eastern borders of Massachusetts Bay, writes that a great number of Indians, the remains of the ancient Norridgewock tribe, frequent that neighborhood. They have a great aversion to the English nation, chiefly owing to the influence of Roman Catholic missionaries, who, instead of endeavoring to reform their morals, comply with them in their most extravagant vices, and teach them that nothing is necessary to eternal salvation but to believe in the name of Christ, to acknowledge the Pope as holy viceroy, and to extirpate the English, because they cruelly murdered the Savior of mankind. End of section 8. Section 9 of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder by John Erskine. Reflection 17 to 20. 17. These things are by the great and the many not forgotten. Popery is esteemed politically innocent, nay friendly to government, and the principles of dissenters are traduced as seditious and rebellious. The late disturbances in the colonies are reduced in support of this charge, and are painted in the most aggravated and ugly colors, while the riots and murders committed by the white boys in Ireland are never mentioned as indications of an unpeaceable and ungovernable spirit in Catholics. It is not remembered that the Episcopal colonies of Virginia and Carolina have discovered the greatest zeal and warmth of any of the colonies in opposition to the measures of administration. New England, that immediately suffered by them, accepted that the dissenting colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey have been esteemed the most moderate, that the Presbyterian clergy in the middle colonies exerted their utmost endeavors to allay the heats occasioned by the Stamp Act, and till very lately took no part, either from the press or pulpit, in the present contentions, and that the convulsions in America originated from causes no way connected with the peculiar sentiments of any religious sects, and which, if there had been a Catholic colony of Corsicans, would have operated upon them, as much as upon the Congregationalists of New England. How small a share of the indulgence shown to the Papists in Canada hath been granted to the Presbyterians in New York, though that country, when conquered from the Dutch, was Calvinist and Presbyterian. I know that their opposing the introducing bishops into America hath been complained of as indicating an intolerant, bigoted, and illiberal spirit. But the candid, when apprised of facts, will cease thus to complain, and rather admire their patience under hardships and sufferings. Perhaps in America there may be 5 dissenters for 1 Episcopalian. In New York colony, 2/3 of the inhabitants are Presbyterian, and not above a 15th part Church of England. All the former ask is charters of incorporation to secure the property of their churches and to recover legacies. Such a charter is readily and very justly and properly granted to the most inconsiderable Episcopal society in the province. Before times has the most flourishing and respectable Presbyterian society in it applied to government for a grant so innocent to others, and so essential to themselves, and has often been disappointed. For want of such a grant, they have been obliged to convey the rights of their places of worship to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. They have lost £100 lately bequeathed them, the Episcopal executors keeping the money to themselves, because they know payment could not be compelled by law, and they must lodge their money in private hands, whose honesty is their only security. No wonder, then, they oppose the introducing of the whole body of episcopacy, when they find its little finger so burdensome. They wish not to deprive others of their religious rights. They only desire sufficient security for their own, and that granted, the Episcopalians, without any obstruction from them, may have their bishops as soon as they please. 18. It was natural for all the American colonies to unite their councils in order to procure a repeal of the above-mentioned acts of Parliament, and a redress of the grievances occasioned by them. With this view, a Continental Congress was appointed and met. Probably the legality of this meeting was not very scrupulously considered, and most of its members would reckon a small violation of human laws excusable, when necessary for preserving natural and charter privileges. Their particular assemblies had sent repeated petitions to Parliament, which had been refused, some because they were against money bills, and others because they disputed the right of the British legislature. On other occasions, legal methods of presenting their remonstrances and complaints were obstructed by governors dissolving or refusing to call the provincial assemblies. When the old constitutional channel of conveying their sentiments was thus stopped, it was not to be wondered at that they thought it necessary to adopt a new method of doing it, that, though possibly less legal, might perhaps prove more effectual. Besides, an act of the 1st of William and Mary declares the right of subjects to present their grievances and petitions to the king for redress, and if they have such a right, surely they may depute some of their numbers to act for them in exercising it. I wish all their proceedings admitted as favorable an apology. Non-importation and non-exportation agreements may be legal, for if men may trade or not, as they choose, I cannot see why united resolutions of doing what is legal can be contrary to law. But of the equity, prudence, and moderation of that measure I am not satisfied. And if more the spirit of the Pennsylvania Provincial Congress had appeared among them, perhaps they would have less cause to confess, the Britons and colonists, to regret their having done the things they ought not to have done, and omitted the things they ought to have done. But I am writing to Britons, not to colonists, from the interruption of correspondence with America. I am not sufficiently instructed in the proceedings of that Congress, or of what hath happened since, to make particular reflections. Without breach of charity or truth, or adopting the unjust and aggravated charges on either side, I may apply to both Horace's description, Epistle 2, Seditione dolus sclerae, atque libidini, et ira, helicos intra, euros peccator et extra. 19. From the continuance of the breach, more and worse evils may be dreaded. It is high time for both sides to consider, not so much what they can justly claim, as what they can safely yield, and whether it is not best to secure advantages from their mutual connection, which may be secured without the further effusion of blood, or endangering the complete and final dissolution of their connection. Of the last, some can think and talk with great indifference. I must be excused in differing from them, as I apprehend the dissolving of their connection would soon prove the ruin of both countries. The consequences to Britain are obvious. The colonies are the source of our wealth, from whom our commerce receives its very life and existence, and our naval strength, its continual supply and increase. The customers we gain in foreign trade, we possess under restrictions and difficulties, and may lose in the rivalship of commerce. Those that a trading nation can create within herself, it deals with under its own regulations, makes its own and cannot lose. In establishing colonies, a nation creates people, whose labor increases her manufacture and exports and extends her power, on which valuable consideration they have a right to the privileges and protections which they receive. The West Indies must dreadfully suffer, if not starve, by having their commerce stopped with North America. They get all their bread and flour, staves heading and hoop poles, and most of their animal food from thence, and must forever depend on North America, because they cannot form a magazine of provisions on account of the heat and vermin, and cannot be regularly and constantly supplied from any other quarter. Thousands employed in the American trade must suffer by the want of that market, and the treasury must be greatly impoverished by a period being put to exportations from America. The duty of tobacco exported from Virginia to England amounts to 300,000 pounds sterling per annum. What then must be the amount of all the duties paid by the produce of all the colonies? And what must the nation lose by such a deduction from her annual income? 20. But some will plead There is no danger of the colonies succeeding in the present contest. They are a dastardly pusillanimous people, and though some of them can fight when sheltered by dikes and hedges, the numerous fleets and land forces we are about to send to America will soon subdue their obstinacy and reduce them to reason. I am not convinced that the Americans are wanting in spirit and courage. The raising fortifications provided by God and nature is no more an argument of cowardice than our army guarding against attacks by works of their own raising. Fortitude and foolhardiness are different. When a false rumor spread through New England that the fleets and troops were firing upon the town of Boston, they were 30 or 40,000 men in arms in less than 24 hours, and some of them had marched from 20 to 30 miles towards Boston before they were undeceived. An enthusiastic passion for liberty has often undertaken the most desperate designs, and yet succeeded in them. And if I may judge by conversations with North Americans, or by the sentiments or style of their letters and publications, such a spirit is strong and prevalent among them. Let me mention one instance. When in the Continental Congress 1774, the danger of a rupture with Britain was urged as a plea for certain concessions. Mr. Samuel Adams rose up and, among other things, said, "I should advise persisting in our struggle for liberty. Though it was revealed from heaven that 999 were to perish in the struggle, and only one of 1,000 to survive and to retain his liberty, one such freeman must possess more virtue and enjoy more happiness than 1,000 slaves, and let him propagate his like, and transmit to them what he hath so nobly preserved. Tell them that our fleets can reduce to ashes all their maritime towns. They readily acknowledge it, but coolly reply that however deep and heavy such a calamity would prove to many of them, they would deem liberty cheaply purchased, at the expense not of Boston only, but of all their harbors. The superiority of our officers, military discipline, artillery, and pecuniary resources they do not dispute, but flatter themselves these advantages will be balanced by their union in number, and that more vigorous exertion and persevering steadiness are to be expected in those who fight from principle, than in men hired to hazard their lives for 6 pence a day, and who, by running away, may earn 2 shillings a day for their work, or get land where they may live plentifully, and provide for their wives and family. They believe that all the military force of the mother country is unable to conquer, or if conquered, to secure the subjection of their wide extended continent. In the first, I suppose they will find themselves mistaken, and that Britain, though with greater difficulty, and at a more enormous expense than administration once apprehended, may turn a once fruitful and flourishing country into a waste and desolate wilderness, rival states with pleasure, permitting conquest from which, though our fleets and armies may reap laurels, they alone will derive profit. We may probably pull down American grandeur, but in pulling it down, we bid fair to bury the honor and happiness of the British Empire in the ruins. Or if America, without being ruined, should be subdued, if to prevent her utter destruction, she should submit to terms of pacification that appear to her cruel and unjust, is it not probable that resentment and hatred against Britain will be transmitted from father to son, and the first opportunity seized of shaking off the galling yoke? Measures of severity may increase our power for a season, but the affection of the colonies alone can render it permanent. A little yielding in this critical season may in no distant period prevent our losing all. From the vast fleets and armies that have been sent to America, and the great majority in favors of administration in both houses of Parliament, and from the weak and inconsiderable opposition made to these measures in most parts of the United Kingdom, sober-minded Americans must dread the most calamitous consequences from war with Britain, and be disposed to make every concession that they account compatible with the security of their liberty. If we ask more, we may drive them to a despair, which, when too late, we may repent our having provoked. A foreign power at war with us may furnish them with the means of becoming independent, or, as Governor Powell has conjectured, a commander-in-chief of all North America in the possession of his power of levying forces and carrying on war, like another monk, may negotiate to deprive the prince of his power, or the subject of liberty. Nay, when the nation is engaged in some future dangerous war, may erect a new empire in America. Our artful and ambitious neighbor, when she perceives us sufficiently weakened by an expensive and bloody contention with our colonies, may attack us when most unable to resist. At least it is not improbable that in some future struggle with our natural enemies we may fatally succumb for want of these assistances of men and money, which, had we acted a wiser part, the increased number and wealth of our colonies would have enabled, and their affection and gratitude inclined them to have furnished us. To some who dislike the colonists for their attachment to revolution principles, and to the illustrious house of Hanover, and who, with the crown of Britain on the head of a popish pretender, this may appear not an evil to be deprecated, but a consummation devoutly to be wished for. For that class of men, the foregoing sheets were not intended. An honest Tory, an honest Jacobite, I respect, though I despise and detest the principles of passive obedience, non-resistance, and indefeasible hereditary right. I venerate and love the men who, from a conscientious regard to these principles, have risked or forfeited their fortunes or lives. But I cannot respect, I must detest, treachery and deceit. I cannot respect the men who call themselves the king's friends, may claim a monopoly of that title, or at least would exclude from it every Whig who understands his principles, and thinks and acts consistently with them, while they rejoice in the prospect that the contentions of our sovereign's true friends may overturn his throne and Britain's liberty. I would not involve in the charge of such black dissimulation any whose words or actions have not given evidence of it. I acknowledge that men who condemn the revolution may be conscientious subjects to his majesty, and I well know some of them who would deem rebellion against him criminal. Yet surely some jealousy that there may be a snake in the grass is almost unavoidable when individuals and communities which till lately labored under the strongest suspicions of disaffection to government, commerce, all of a sudden the most zealous advocates for the measures of administration. Timeo de Llanos et Dona Ferentes, Vini. End of section 9. End of Reflections on the Rise, Progress, and Probable Consequences of the Present Contentions with the Colonies by a Freeholder by John Erskine.